Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This week's parasha is Parasha Acharei Mot Kedoshim, which means after the death and holy ones. It's the 6th and 7th parasha of the book of Vayikra, also called Leviticus. And I've been experimenting with how I'm going to do my little videos here. Normally I write a message for the parasha every week, and I thought, well, I don't like when I'm just reading right off the page. I think it doesn't come across very well. And then I tried to kind of ad-lib it before, and I thought, then I'm not always covering everything. So one of the things that I do, I thought I'd share with you, there's a concept called mind mapping, and I want to say that it comes Tony Buzan, and it's various, I'll show you an example of one. It's what I do with each of the parashas here. So you can see right there, that's the weekly Parasha Acharei Mot Kedoshim, and in the middle you can see it's the title of my message, which is Truth Consumes Lies, for this week's parasha. I'll try and do this here so I can show you and see it. And then off there you see some of the key points that I put in here: Nadav and Abihu, Azazel, Day of Atonement, 10 Commandments, Nations Before You, Patterns and Application. And then I go into the little thing. The concept of mind mapping is just about how your mind remembers things, and it gives you a visual. So I found that instead of, it's kind of an alternative to an outline. It's a more organic way of organizing your thoughts. Anyway, that's a side note, but I just thought I'd share with that, because I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk off of these points, these concepts, and kind of share real quick. So it won't be exactly all the details. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to post my message online in the text format, so that people who want the whole, where I can explain it and I'm hitting all the points, can see that. And then if they want kind of more of a summary of what I designed that message off of, then that's what I would do here. So anyway, so let's get started. This parasha, the message that I'm writing is called Truth Consumes Lies. And in this week's parasha, you have the main points as I already went over. First you have it talking about Acharei Mot, which is after the death of Nadav and Abihu. And the thing that I pulled off of this is that there's this concept with Nadav and Abihu of acceptable and unacceptable. It doesn't go into detail exactly what was going on. There's many thoughts about what they did wrong. Was it because the fire wasn't the fire from the altar? Was it some practice that they did? Was it a strange incense? Or was it something that they weren't supposed to do? Was it the wrong times? There's lots of different theories. The concept, though, that I see behind it is the concept of being acceptable or unacceptable. Aharon had 4 sons. Essentially, 2 of them are alive and 2 of them were killed. And so what I see in this most basic model is that, in a sense, one set was acceptable, one was unacceptable in what they did. So this actually kind of goes over the whole concept of a man, because the sons represent a man. So he had 4 sons, so in a sense, but they're a model of him and who he is, because he passes on all of his things. And just like Mashiach, who is one with the Father, he's doing his will. It's the concept of Banah, the Hebrew word for son, the builder of authority or name. So in this concept, the sons are supposed to be like their father. And so in this way, it paints an interesting picture with Aharon, that a man has parts of him represented by his sons that are unacceptable and parts that are acceptable. And the concept is that the Torah, or truth, represented by Yodewaheh, is going to consume, the truth is going to consume the lies, the things that aren't right. And so we see this picture with Nadav and Abihu as 2 of his sons were consumed with fire, leaving the remainder of the ones that were doing what was acceptable to Yodewaheh. We can see this in religion. In many ways, the acceptable is Yodewaheh's ways, and religion, which can roughly be defined as what Nadav and Abihu were doing, were things that weren't necessarily what Yodewaheh told you to do. They were still being religious. They were trying to worship Yodewaheh in a different way than what he prescribed to him, and that was a way that was unacceptable. So I think that's an important point, because a lot of people right now feel like anything goes. Well, Mashiach's gone, and so between now and then, everyone's coming up with their own ministries, their own ideas, their own interpretations of whatever's true. But even it says in the scriptures that when he returns, it won't be everybody, no one will say, know the Lord, because he's going to write the law on our inward parts. So there's not going to be a question about does it mean this, does it mean that. Then we'll just be held accountable to whether or not we're going to be willing to do it or not. So the concept there for Nadav and Avihu is the concept of seeking truth. Seek Yodewahe's ways, and be weary of learning the ways of man and the interpretations of man. Next we get to the Azazel. This is an interesting thing, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but we have the basic concept again when we break it down of one being killed and one being saved. One being offered as a sin sacrifice, the other is set free with the sins of Israel on his head to go into the wilderness. And the wilderness is a model of the time that we're in. It's the time where we've come to the realization to leave Mitzrayim, which is oppression, which models sin. So we come to this point where we're going to leave sin, but we haven't got to the kingdom yet. So in this time of learning and growing is a model of the wilderness. And what we have on our heads, which I think really should be in our minds, is the sins of Israel. That's like the Torah. The Torah shows us all the sins of the people before us, and that should be in our minds when we're making our decisions, when we're going through this tough wilderness. Thinking back about, even the New Testament says that those things were an example for us to teach us on our journey. So next we go into the Day of Atonement. This is the concept of the perfect and the blemished. The blemished are represented by the sinful people who come to it, and Israel, who come to a Day of Atonement. This is the concept of judgment. And what they're needing is they're needing to offer a perfect offering. And this is going to alleviate the punishment for their sins. Their sins are going to be forgiven them. The funny thing is everyone always points to, oh, Mashiach is perfect offering, and of course he was. But Mashiach also represents the truth in the Torah. So a lot of people don't understand that the Torah and the patterns of the Torah and righteousness are what's the acceptable offering. He is the acceptable offering. They think that it's just Mashiach from the year 30 AD or whenever he was crucified, that was the offering. That was the physical offering right then. And that's covered, and there isn't anything else that matters and anything that's important up until that point. Whereas the fact is that pattern of him, when he says that he is the Word, he is the Torah, and the Torah represents the unblemished offering. So how I see that is that when we go through this wilderness, when we get up to this point, this Day of Atonement, this judgment, what is acceptable is the offering of obedience to Torah. That's what Mashiach represented, the truth, and that's what's going to be acceptable. So for you personally, I think that means that you focus on living out the truth, because we combine that with what Ezekiel says, and Ezekiel says that the person who was wicked but then turns to righteousness, so he was unacceptable and blemished. He was a breaker of the Torah. Then he turns to being a keeper of the Torah. Then his violations of the Torah will be forgotten. So I think that's the same pattern we see in the Day of Atonement, and I think that pattern includes us instead of excludes us. So a lot of Christianity and a lot of religious, even Messianics, they think that, well, Mashiach did it, so that excludes me from my personal responsibility. All I have to do is believe that he did it, and somehow I'm not responsible anymore for anything then or anything in the future. Well, the pattern of Day of Atonement doesn't show that. The pattern of Day of Atonement, as a matter of fact, was something that happened every year, and because you sinned more, you needed atonement again. And the concept is that with Day of Atonement, you had to come in. You were still responsible on Day of Atonement to afflict your souls and to do all this and that. This affliction, I believe, this concept of affliction comes in, is the model of repentance. And repentance is to turn. It's to turn away from wicked